In secret, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has shown his tremendous support in rebuilding the Third Temple. Recently, he released a video walking through underground tunnels beneath Al-Aqsa, which some believe are intended to weaken the foundations of the mosque and justify a takeover of the Temple Mount.
That very soon we will all see the building of the Third Temple in Jerusalem very soon.
That Netanyahu's actually privately been funding some of the push through the rabbis around this conversation of building a third temple, but he certainly extended. And he said, the Temple Mount is in our hands. Now, he said that in that famous statement.
The Temple Mount is in our hands. We are in Jerusalem, and we are here to stay.
That was definitely sending a signal that he, too, is aware of this movement towards the construction of a third temple. In fact, I've been told that privately.
5 animals from a Texas ranch arrived in Israel 3 years ago. Nobody made headlines. Nobody held press conferences. Yet today, what they're about to do could reset 2,000 years of history. And the clock is ticking toward a moment that changes everything. For most of human history, this seemed impossible. Experts said it couldn't happen. Religious scholars thought it was fantasy. Yet here we are, watching something unfold that people once believed belonged only to ancient history books. What are these 5 animals? Why does their existence matter so much? And what happens when they reach a specific age in just a few months? The answer connects ancient religious law, modern preparation, and a prophecy that has waited for 2 millennia to move forward. In Jerusalem, the preparations have been quiet but deliberate. Teams have spent decades crafting items that haven't existed since the year 70 AD. Priests have been identified. Training has occurred. Sacred garments have been recreated with precision. Yet none of this can begin without one specific requirement being met. That requirement is racing against time right now. Most people don't realize what's actually happening in the Middle East because the story has been buried under layers of complexity. Media coverage focuses on conflict and politics. But underneath, something else is moving forward, something tied directly to religious prophecy and ancient law. The 5 animals from Texas represent a turning point, not because of emotion or symbolism, but because of strict biblical requirements that have remained unchanged for thousands of years. By the end of this video, you'll understand why historians are watching. You'll see why religious scholars are paying attention. And you'll recognize why this moment feels different from any other moment in the past 2,000 years. The question isn't whether this will happen. The question is when and what comes next. Let's walk through what's really going on. To understand why these 5 animals matter, you need to know what happened in the year 70 AD. Roman armies surrounded Jerusalem. After months of siege, the walls fell. The temple, the center of Jewish religious life for over 500 years, was destroyed. Not partially damaged, completely obliterated. Soldiers dismantled it stone by stone, looking for gold and silver. When they finished, almost nothing remained. The Jewish people faced a crisis unlike anything they'd experienced before. For centuries, their entire religious system depended on one location, the temple in Jerusalem. Priests made daily sacrifices there. Worshippers gathered for festivals. Religious law centered around temple worship. Suddenly, all of that ended. But here's where it gets complicated. The Jewish people couldn't simply rebuild the temple immediately. Roman occupation prevented it. Political instability made it impossible. Over centuries, the Temple Mount became home to other structures. Eventually, a mosque was built on the exact location where the temple once stood. Yet the religious requirement never disappeared. In the book of Numbers, God gave a command that was different from any other command in Scripture. Not about building armies, not about governing nations, not about warfare. A command about purity, specifically about one animal, a red heifer. Here's what the law says: a red heifer without spot, without blemish, and without ever being used for labor had to be found. This animal would be sacrificed outside the camp. It would be burned entirely. Its ashes would be mixed with water. This mixture, the water of purification, became essential for temple worship. Why? Because anyone who touched a dead body became unclean. Without the water of purification, priests couldn't serve. Sacrifices couldn't be made. The entire religious system couldn't function. Think about that requirement. A completely red animal, without defects, without labor, no other color mixed in. Even one hair of a different color disqualified the entire animal. For 2,000 years, this requirement sat waiting. Jewish tradition teaches that only a small number of red heifers were ever sacrificed. Even during the times when temples actually existed, the requirement was always rare. always difficult, always specific. After the destruction of the temple, finding even one red heifer that met these exact requirements seemed impossible. Centuries passed. Empires rose and fell. Jerusalem changed hands repeatedly. Yet the requirement in Numbers 19 remained untouched, like a law written in stone, waiting for the day when someone tried to fulfill it again. Rabbis studied the requirement. Scholars debated it. Theologians discussed whether it would ever be possible to complete again. Many believed the answer was no. The window had closed. History had moved on. But then something changed. In the 1990s, a movement began, not to rebuild the temple immediately, that faced obvious obstacles, but to prepare, to get ready, to study what would need to happen if, somehow, the opportunity ever came. Organizations formed, teams of scholars gathered, craftspeople began recreating items described in ancient scripture. Priests from the lineage of Aaron were identified and trained. And then, in September 2022, 5 red heifers arrived from Texas. Not 1, 5, which meant if even one of them remained without blemish as they aged, the first valid red heifer in nearly 2,000 years could be available. For the first time in 2 millennia, the foundational requirement was no longer just a theoretical discussion. It was becoming real. The story of how these 5 heifers arrived in Israel reads like something from a documentary nobody expected to make. In Texas, on a ranch where animals are carefully bred for specific traits, 5 young red heifers were selected. This wasn't random. The selection process was meticulous. Every animal had to match specific criteria. Completely red coloring, no defects, no marks, no signs of previous labor or injury. The ranchers understood what they were being asked to do. They weren't simply selling livestock. They were potentially participating in something connected to ancient religious law and prophecy. When the decision was made to transport these 5 animals to Israel, it wasn't done secretly, but it was done carefully. The movement of the heifers was documented. Religious organizations oversaw the process. Teams in Israel prepared facilities to receive them. Since their arrival in 2022, these animals have lived under strict supervision. And when we say strict, we mean exactly that. Every detail matters. Their environment is controlled. The food they eat is monitored. Their health is checked regularly. Even the smallest change in appearance, a single mark, a sign of sickness, any physical defect, could disqualify them from meeting the biblical requirements. This level of attention isn't unusual for important breeding programs. But in this case, the stakes feel different. Because these 5 animals aren't being raised to compete in shows or produce premium beef. They're being raised because they might fulfill a 2,000-year-old requirement. As of 2025, these heifers are approaching the minimum age for sacrifice. The biblical requirement specifies that a red heifer must be at least 3 years old. Some of these animals are moving toward that threshold right now. Think about the timeline. 5 animals, 3-year requirement, multiple checkpoints where any imperfection disqualifies them. The odds of even one surviving to that age without developing a single disqualifying mark are significant. Yet here's what makes this moment different. For nearly 2 millennia, nobody could attempt this. There were no candidates. The requirement seemed impossible. Generations of believers lived and died without ever seeing even one red heifer that met the standards. Now, there are 5 possibilities. If even one of these animals reaches the required age without blemish, something unprecedented would become possible. Not certain, but it is possible. And that possibility has created a kind of quiet momentum. Religious scholars are watching. Historical societies are tracking updates. News organizations occasionally report on the heifer's progress. And in Jerusalem, teams that have spent decades preparing for a moment they thought might never come are reconsidering what could actually happen. The Texas heifers represent more than just animals. They represent a shift from "this is theoretically possible" to "this is actually happening." And the clock is moving forward. But here's the thing that nobody talks about enough. Even if one heifer meets all the requirements, even if the sacrifice happens, even if the ashes are collected, that's only the beginning. Because the real preparations have been happening in a completely different location. While the world focused on Middle East politics and daily news cycles, something else was happening behind closed doors in Jerusalem. The Temple Institute, an organization founded in 1987, made a decision that seemed impossible at the time. They would prepare as if rebuilding the temple was actually possible. Not to build it immediately, not to make political claims, but to be ready, to study scripture carefully, and to recreate the items that would be necessary if the opportunity ever came. This wasn't a spontaneous project. It was systematic, methodical, decades of work. Scholars began studying the descriptions of temple items found in ancient texts. They examined historical records. They consulted with craftspeople who specialized in ancient techniques. And then they began recreating. The priestly garments described in Exodus were studied in detail. Every thread, every measurement, every color specification. Teams worked to recreate these garments with accuracy, not as costumes or artistic renditions, but as functional religious items that would meet ancient specifications. The golden menorah, the 7-branched candelabrum that stood in the temple, was recreated, not from memory, not from imagination, but from careful study of descriptions in scripture and historical documentation. The altar of incense was built. The table of showbread was crafted. Musical instruments used in temple worship were reconstructed. Vessels for the temple service were designed and created. This wasn't hobby work. This was serious religious preparation. And it continued for decades while most of the world remained unaware it was happening. Then came the priestly preparation. In Jewish tradition, only descendants of Aaron could serve as priests. The priestly lineage was carefully documented and maintained through history. Teams began identifying men from these lineages and providing them with training. They studied ancient law. They learned the procedures. They prepared themselves mentally and spiritually for a role that hadn't existed in nearly 2,000 years. All of this preparation, the garments, the vessels, the instruments, the trained priests, existed without a functioning temple. It was preparation for a future that seemed uncertain at best and impossible at worst. But it continued anyway. Why? Because in religious belief, obedience to law sometimes means acting in faith before circumstances change. The preparations weren't made because the temple was about to be built. They were made because ancient law required certain items to exist, and if the law was ever going to be followed again, those items needed to be ready. Now consider the timing. For decades, the Temple Institute prepared in relative obscurity. Then, in September 2022, 5 red heifers arrived from Texas. Suddenly, the theoretical became practical. The preparation wasn't abstract anymore. There were actual animals that might fulfill the requirement. The garments that had been sitting in storage for years took on new meaning. The vessels that craftspeople had created now had a potential purpose. The priests who had been trained suddenly realized their preparation might actually matter. But here's what people don't understand about religious law. The red heifer isn't just one requirement among many. It's the foundation. Without the ashes from a red heifer, nothing else can begin. The priests can't be purified. The temple can't be consecrated. The daily sacrifices can't be made. Every other preparation, all the decades of work, depends on this single requirement being met first. This is why the 5 animals from Texas changed everything. And this is why the people watching closely aren't just religious enthusiasts. They're historians tracking a moment that could reshape how an entire religious system functions. But there's another layer to this story that most people have completely missed. To understand why this moment feels significant to so many people, you need to understand what ancient prophets predicted. The prophet Ezekiel lived during the Babylonian exile, centuries before the Roman destruction of the temple. Yet he described a vision, detailed, precise, filled with measurements and architectural specifications, of a temple that would exist in the future. This vision is unusual. It's not poetic or metaphorical. It's technical. Ezekiel provides room dimensions. He describes construction details. He specifies the placement of gates and chambers. The level of detail suggests he was describing an actual building, not a symbolic concept. Many religious scholars interpret this as a prophecy about a third temple, a temple that would be built after the second temple's destruction. For nearly 2,000 years, this prophecy sat in scripture, and nobody could do much with it. The Temple Mount was occupied. Building there seemed impossible. The requirement for a red heifer couldn't be met. Then Jesus entered the conversation, and the interpretation became more complex. In the Gospel of Matthew, Jesus spoke of a moment called the abomination of desolation. He referenced prophecy from Daniel and spoke of a holy place standing in the future. His statement assumed that at some point, there would be a functioning temple again, a place holy enough that its desecration would matter. For Christians, this created a theological puzzle. Jesus was crucified and rose from the dead. He transcended the need for temple sacrifice through his own death. So why would Jesus reference a future temple? Why would he speak as if temple worship would exist again? Different Christian traditions have different answers. Some believe the prophecy is symbolic, referring to spiritual rather than physical rebuilding. Others believe a literal temple will exist in the future before the end times, and Jesus was preparing his followers to understand that moment. The point is, both Jewish and Christian prophecy traditions contain references to a future temple. And both traditions suggest that at some point, temple worship, with all its requirements, including the red heifer purification, would function again. Now, here's where it gets interesting. The book of Hebrews, written by early Christians, connects the red heifer specifically to Jesus. It says the ashes of a red heifer purified the body from physical uncleanness. But Jesus purifies the conscience from spiritual uncleanness. The heifer had to be without blemish. Jesus was without sin. The heifer was rare. Jesus was unique. So from a Christian perspective, the red heifer was always a sign pointing towards something greater, toward Jesus himself. Yet the prophecy about a future temple still sits in Scripture. And if a physical temple exists again, it would need to follow ancient law, which means it would need a red heifer. This is why the 5 animals from Texas have captured attention across religious traditions. Not because anyone thinks a red heifer sacrifice would replace Christian theology, but because it connects to prophecies about the end times, about a moment when history moves toward a significant culmination. For people who study Bible prophecy, these developments feel like pieces moving on a board, not randomly, not accidentally, but according to a script written thousands of years ago. But here's what most people miss about prophecy. It doesn't announce itself with clear headlines. It doesn't demand attention. It unfolds quietly, often while people focus on other things. And by the time someone realizes what's happening, the moment might already be here. Which brings us to what's actually happening right now in Jerusalem. As Passover approaches, tensions in Jerusalem shift into a different gear. Jewish extremist groups, small but vocal, have announced plans to enter the Al-Aqsa Mosque compound. They frame this as reclaiming a religious site. They cite historical claims about the temple that once stood in that location. And they announce these plans knowing that Israeli security forces might provide protection. To Palestinians, this is a violation of an understanding that has held for decades. The status quo arrangement allows Muslims to manage the Al-Aqsa Mosque while Jewish visitors can access certain areas without conducting religious ceremonies. Any change to this arrangement feels like a threat. The Jordanian Waqf, the Islamic trust that manages the compound, has criticized the planned incursions. Regional tensions spike. International observers watch carefully. The situation feels like a powder keg waiting for a spark. But here's what makes this moment different from previous tensions at that site. The plans are being announced alongside growing confidence about the red heifer preparations. The two aren't officially connected, but they exist at the same moment, which means that for the first time in modern history, there's genuine infrastructure, the trained priests, the prepared vessels, the religious motivation, to actually move forward if the opportunity opens up. Previous threats to the status quo felt like political posturing. Now, they're being made by people who actually have preparations in place. Additionally, plans are being discussed about slaughtering the red heifers, or at least being ready to do so, at a location outside the Temple Mount, as biblical law specifies. The ashes would be collected and preserved. The purification process would begin for the first time in over 2,000 years. This isn't theoretical anymore. This is operational planning. Israeli authorities are aware of all this. They're managing the security situation while being careful not to ignite international incidents. But they're also allowing the preparations to continue, which suggests, at minimum, that the Israeli government isn't stopping these movements. The situation creates a complex dynamic. Religious groups are pushing forward with preparations. Political authorities are allowing it while managing security. International observers are watching carefully, and the red heifers continue aging, moving toward the moment when they either qualify or don't. Meanwhile, most of the global news media has barely covered any of this. People scroll through their phones. They see headlines about everyday politics. They miss the fact that infrastructure for temple worship, the actual religious mechanism to support it, is being prepared in real time. It's not being hidden. It's just not being broadcast loudly. And that quiet nature makes it easy to miss. But for people who study prophecy, who understand ancient religious law, who pay attention to these movements in Jerusalem, something significant is happening. Not definitely, but possibly. And that possibility is creating a momentum that might not be stoppable now. Here's the question that keeps historians and scholars awake at night. What happens in the next few months? The 5 red heifers are approaching 3 years old. Some might reach that age without developing disqualifying defects. If even one does, a decision point arrives. Do religious groups attempt the sacrifice? Do Israeli authorities allow it? How do Palestinians and the international community respond? The scenario seems straightforward when you describe it simply, but in reality, it's politically explosive. A red heifer sacrifice would be interpreted as a direct act of religious reclamation. It would be seen as preparation for temple rebuilding. It would be understood, by supporters and critics alike, as a move toward replacing the Al-Aqsa Mosque with a rebuilt Jewish temple. International tensions would spike immediately. The Middle East would become even more unstable. Religious leaders worldwide would issue statements. News media would suddenly cover something they've largely ignored. The quiet preparations would become very loud. But here's what matters. By that point, it might be too late to stop. The sacrifice would either happen or it wouldn't. The ashes would either be collected or they wouldn't. And once it happened, once the first red heifer in nearly 2,000 years was sacrificed, the religious law would be partially fulfilled. That's the critical window, not the 5 years of preparation, not the decades of crafting temple items, but the moment when a red heifer, an actual animal, reaches the required age and meets the requirements. That's when everything shifts. Some scholars believe this window is closing. They point out that the current geopolitical moment, with certain political authorities in place, might be the only time this would be allowed. Once this administration changes, once political winds shift, the opportunity might vanish. Others are more cautious. They point out that many barriers still exist. The red heifers might develop defects. Authorities might prevent the sacrifice. International pressure might be strong enough to stop it. But nobody who studies this seriously denies that we're in a different moment than we were 5 years ago. The possibility exists where it didn't before. And possibilities, once they exist, have a way of moving toward reality. Think about it from a religious perspective. If you believe that ancient law was still binding, if you believe that prophecy was unfolding, if you had spent decades preparing for this moment, and suddenly, the foundational requirement, something that seemed impossible, became available, would you wait? Would you hesitate? For many believers, the answer is no. They would move forward. They would attempt the sacrifice. They would collect the ashes. They would continue the process. And once that happened, the next phase would begin, which is where we enter territory that even scholars have trouble predicting. If a red heifer is sacrificed and the ashes are collected, what actually happens? Theoretically, the water of purification is prepared. Priests from the lineage of Aaron can be purified. Temple worship can begin again in some form. But here's where religious law meets practical reality in complicated ways. The Temple Mount is occupied by the Al-Aqsa Mosque. Rebuilding a temple there would require removing the mosque. That's not just a religious issue. It's a geopolitical crisis. Muslims worldwide consider the Al-Aqsa Mosque a sacred site. Removing it would generate international outrage. So would the temple be built elsewhere? Would it be built in a different form? Would it be a spiritual temple rather than physical? Different traditions have different answers. Some scholars believe that even without a physical temple, the sacrifice and purification could begin. Priests could serve in temporary structures. Religious law could be followed without waiting for a full building project. Others believe the entire prophecy hinges on an actual temple structure. They point to Ezekiel's detailed measurements and argue that the prophecy describes a real building, not a metaphorical practice. What's clear is this: once the red heifer requirement is met, religious dynamics change. The possibility becomes practical. Believers who have waited for this moment their entire lives would have cause to hope that the rest of the prophecy might follow. For Christians, this creates theological questions that denominations have been debating for centuries. Does a functioning Jewish temple conflict with Christian theology? Is it possible for both systems to coexist? What does it mean for prophecy if the temple is rebuilt? Different Christian traditions have different answers. Some see it as incompatible with Christianity. Others see it as an important part of end-times prophecy. Still others view it as a parallel religious system that doesn't conflict with faith in Jesus. The point is, this isn't just a religious matter. It's a geopolitical matter, a theological matter, a historical matter, and a prophetic matter all at once. And all of those dimensions are moving toward a critical moment simultaneously, which is why so many people from different traditions, different nations, different perspectives are watching what happens with these 5 red heifers. Because the outcome affects not just Jewish religious practice. It affects how prophecy unfolds. It affects Middle East stability. It affects international relations. And it affects how millions of people understand their faith and their future. This is bigger than 5 animals. This is about whether ancient law and prophecy can move from history books into living reality. And that moment might be months away, or it might be decades away, or it might never happen. But for the first time in 2,000 years, it's actually possible. What's striking about these developments isn't just what's happening, it's how it's happening. For nearly 2 millennia, the conditions for fulfilling this prophecy seemed impossible. The temple was destroyed. The site was occupied. The religious infrastructure didn't exist. The red heifer requirement couldn't be met. Every obstacle seemed permanent. Every barrier seemed insurmountable. Yet over the past few decades, obstacles have fallen away, one by one, not through dramatic revolutions, but through consistent, patient preparation and shifting circumstances. Organizations formed, scholars studied, craftspeople created, priests trained, international support emerged. Political authorities allowed the preparations. And finally, the foundational requirement, a red heifer, became available. From a purely historical perspective, this is remarkable. It's the kind of thing that doesn't happen by accident. It happens because enough people believed it could happen and worked toward making it possible. But here's what spiritual traditions teach about prophecy. Prophecy doesn't announce itself loudly. It unfolds quietly, often while people focus on other things. By the time someone realizes what's happening, the moment might already be here. Jesus taught his followers to be alert, to watch, to pay attention to signs. Not because he was predicting a specific date or a specific event, but because history and faith intersect at moments when people aren't paying attention. For believers who study prophecy, the current moment feels like one of those intersections. Not because something dramatic has already happened, but because something is possible that wasn't possible before. And that possibility is creating momentum. In the book of Hebrews, there's a connection drawn between the red heifer and Jesus. The heifer purified the body. Jesus purifies the conscience. The heifer was without blemish. Jesus was without sin. The heifer was rare. Jesus was unique. This comparison suggests that in Christian theology, the red heifer always pointed towards something deeper, toward Jesus, towards spiritual purification that transcends physical ritual. So the question becomes, can both things be true? Can there be a physical red heifer sacrifice that follows ancient law? And can that be consistent with Christian faith that Jesus already provided the ultimate purification? Different traditions answer differently, but what unites them is recognition that we're in a moment worth watching. A moment when ancient law and modern circumstances are aligning, when prophecy that seemed impossible is becoming possible. This doesn't mean the prophecy will definitely be fulfilled. It doesn't mean the temple will definitely be rebuilt. It doesn't mean dramatic events are definitely coming. But it means the pieces are in place. The groundwork is laid. The possibility exists. And that's enough to make this moment significant. Because possibilities, once they exist, have a way of moving forward. Here's what we know right now. 5 red heifers from Texas are aging in Israel. They're approaching the 3-year mark when they could theoretically be sacrificed. 1 or more might meet the strict biblical requirements. The infrastructure for temple worship has been prepared over decades. Religious groups are ready to move forward. Political authorities are allowing the preparations to continue. And the window is closing. Not because the heifers will suddenly become disqualified, but because political circumstances change. Administrations change. International conditions shift. The moment when this would be possible might not remain open forever. So what happens next? We don't know. That's the honest answer. But we know more than we knew 5 years ago. We know it's possible. We know people are preparing for it. We know prophecies that seemed impossible are becoming practical. And that changes how we understand the world and the future. If you study Bible prophecy, whether from a Jewish perspective, a Christian perspective, or simply as a historical observer, this moment demands attention. Not because the outcome is certain, but because the possibility is real. History is unfolding before our eyes. Ancient law is intersecting with modern circumstances. And prophecy that survived 2,000 years of destruction might be about to move from scripture into reality. The 5 red heifers are still aging. The preparations continue. The window remains open. What happens in the next few months could reshape how an entire religious system functions. It could affect Middle East stability. It could influence how millions of people understand their faith. Or it might not happen at all. But the story isn't finished. The outcome isn't determined. And the next chapter is being written right now, quietly, patiently, according to a script written thousands of years ago. Watch closely, because history doesn't announce itself. It just unfolds.